What happens to a continent when the people whose job it is to stop the fire stand in front of a camera and admit out loud that they cannot stop it? That sentence was spoken this week, not in a movie, not in a warning about the future, but by a real emergency chief in a real press briefing, while behind him, the sky over one of Europe's biggest capital cities turned the color of rust. Before we go further into this, do me one small favor. Hit that like button because it genuinely helps this story reach people who still think this is just summer weather. Subscribe if you want the full picture instead of a 30-second clip. And share this with one person who has family, friends, or a holiday booked anywhere in Southern Europe right now. That share might matter more than you think. All right, let's get into it. Right now, across Spain, France, and Italy, hundreds of thousands of people are not sleeping in their own beds. They are in school gymnasiums, community halls, sports centers, hotel lobbies, and in some cases, in their cars, parked in a field, with the windows shut because the air outside burns the throat. They are not there because of a war. There is no invading army, no earthquake cracked the ground open, no flood swept through the streets. It was fire. Fire moving faster than a person can run. Fire that turned entire villages into gray outlines in a matter of hours. And here is the part that should stop you cold. The most frightening thing about this crisis is not how big the fires are. It is what officials are saying about them. When reporters asked whether these fires could be brought under control, the honest answer that came back was not soon or we are working on it. The answer was closer to not yet, not with what we have, not until the weather itself changes. Let me start with Spain, because what is happening around Madrid should not be possible in a country with this much money, this much technology, and this much experience with fire. Spain did not declare a local emergency. It did not issue a regional warning. The central government activated a national emergency response, which is the level a country reaches when regional authorities lift their hands and say, we cannot carry this anymore. Think about what that actually means. Madrid is the capital of one of the largest nations in Western Europe. It is home to millions of people, and this week, residents walking outside found the air heavy and gray, with the smell of burnt pine hanging over neighborhoods that are nowhere near a forest. The worst of it has been burning west of the city, in the mountain country, that sits on the boundary between the Madrid region and the neighboring province. And this is where the situation crossed from serious into something else entirely, because it was not one fire. Two separate blazes grew toward each other. Along a stretch of roughly 15 kilometers, they came so close that they were effectively touching. Two fires becoming one. And when that happens, the fire stops behaving like a fire and starts behaving like a system. It generates its own wind. It pulls oxygen inward. It throws burning material ahead of itself and starts new fires half a kilometer away, in places nobody was defending. Spain handed command of the operation to its military emergency unit, not the civilian fire service, the military. That unit is not deployed for ordinary summer fires. It exists for catastrophic events, the kind where multiple agencies have to move together instantly and no one has time for paperwork or jurisdiction arguments. The numbers behind that deployment tell the story on their own. More than 2,700 personnel, over 400 ground vehicles, 21 aircraft in rotation, and crews flown in from Greece, Italy, and Portugal because Spain's own resources, in a country that fights fires every single summer, were simply not enough. Then came the sentence that traveled around the world. The emergency chief responsible for the Madrid region described the fire as being at its peak and said plainly that it was beyond the capacity of firefighters to contain. Sit with that for a second. Officials almost never say that. Their entire job is to project calm. They are trained to say the situation is challenging but under control. So when a man in that position stands in front of microphones and says his people cannot stop what is burning, it is not panic. It is honesty of the most uncomfortable kind. It means the alternative, letting people believe they were safe, was more dangerous than telling the truth. In the Madrid region alone, close to 10,000 hectares have been consumed. In the neighboring province, another 13 to 15,000 hectares. Northeast of the capital, a separate fire has already torn through around 32,000 hectares and forced dozens of villages to empty out. And these are not the only ones. Across Spain, more than 30 separate forest fires have been burning at the same time. 30. Not one disaster with a name and a face, but 30 simultaneous emergencies, competing for the same aircraft, the same water bombers, the same exhausted crews. Evacuation orders have covered more than 10,000 residents in the Madrid and neighboring areas, with tens of thousands more. Affected nationwide, at least one person has died. And the Prime Minister, standing at an emergency command post, warned that difficult hours were still ahead, because although temperatures had eased slightly, the winds remained completely unpredictable. That word, unpredictable, is the one that firefighters fear most. You can plan for heat, you can plan for dryness, You cannot plan for a wind that changes direction in 90 seconds and puts the fire behind the line you just spent 6 hours building. Now, let me take you to France, because the number I am about to give you is the kind you will want to hear twice. In southwestern France, near the Atlantic coast, the fires forced the evacuation of roughly 200,000 people from a single department, then add tens of thousands more from separate blazes in nearby communities. Officials described it as one of the largest peacetime evacuations France has ever carried out. Peacetime. They had to add that word. They had to specify it, because the last time this many French civilians were moved this quickly from their homes, the country was at war. Read that again. Europe's fourth largest economy, one of the most visited countries on the planet, a place people associate with vineyards, long lunches, and coastal holidays. And it just ran an evacuation on a scale it normally reserves for armed conflict because of fire. The blazes have been tearing through the forests west of Bordeaux. A famous stretch of Atlantic resort coastline was ordered to clear out entirely. Emergency alerts went straight to people's phones, telling residents of at least 5 communities to leave immediately and head toward Bordeaux. Shelters in the city filled fast. A separate fire further south burned through more than 2,500 hectares on its own and triggered over 23,000 additional evacuations. Whole towns were emptied. And here is a detail that I cannot get out of my head. When residents of one village were finally allowed back to check on their properties, they found charred ruins. Their homes were gone. The fire had passed through in roughly the time it took them to drive to a shelter and drive back. That is the speed we are dealing with. Not days, not hours. Minutes in some cases. France asked for international help, and the answer showed exactly how serious this became. Teams arrived from Romania, Croatia, Germany, Portugal, Sweden, Switzerland, and the Czech Republic. 8 countries sending emergency personnel to help France fight fires on French soil. France deployed everything it had: water-bombing aircraft, military cargo planes dropping fire retardant on forests near Bordeaux, helicopters running endless water cycles. Civilian and military capacity merged into one operation. At least one person has died in the French fires. And authorities kept repeating the same warning. Drought, low humidity, and shifting winds mean any of these fires can surge again without notice. There is one part of the French story that most breaking news coverage skipped right past. It deserves your attention. Bordeaux wine country sits inside that fire zone. One of the most famous wine regions on earth has been sitting under smoke. Wine specialists have been careful with their language, saying the vineyards have not been directly destroyed, but they are warning about something called smoke taint. It is exactly what it sounds like. Grapes absorb compounds from wildfire smoke, and the wine made from those grapes carries a burnt, ashy character that cannot be removed. The fruit looks fine, the wine is ruined. So the economic damage in that region is not only measured in burnt houses and blackened forest. It includes generations of agricultural work, reputation, and land value sitting directly in the path of a fire that officials openly admit they cannot yet fully control. Now let us move to Italy, because Italy's situation is different in a way that changes how you should read this entire crisis. Sicily has been under siege. Since the middle of the month, more than 1,000 firefighting interventions were recorded on the island alone. 1,000 separate emergency responses on one island in roughly 2 weeks. A firefighter died battling a blaze there. Homes across the island were evacuated. Large active fires burned near one town where more than 6,500 hectares went up, and near another where over 3,000 more hectares were lost. Sardinia dealt with its own separate emergencies, including a fire that forced beaches to be cleared and coastal roads to close in the middle of tourist season. But northern Italy shows you the other half of the picture, and it is just as serious even though there are no flames in the photographs. The Po River, the longest river in Italy and the water source for millions of people and thousands of farms, dropped to record low levels under the weight of persistent heat and drought. Municipalities in the Piedmont region introduced steep fines for anyone caught using drinking water to wash a car or water a garden. They are rationing. In one of the wealthiest industrial regions in Europe in a modern year, with modern infrastructure, they are rationing water because there is not enough to go around. Italy has already lost tens of thousands of hectares to fire this year, well above its 20-year average, with elevated fire risk stretching across Sicily, Sardinia, Calabria, and even into parts of the Alpine North. Now here is the thread that ties all 3 countries together, and it is the reason this is not 3 separate news stories. The driver behind every one of these fires is the same, a relentless heat dome that settled over southern and western Europe and refused to move. Record temperatures. Vegetation so dry it can ignite from a single spark off a car exhaust, a power line, a piece of broken glass, and winds that shift without warning and turn a managed fire into a runaway wall within minutes. This is not coincidence. This is one weather system producing simultaneous disasters in 3 countries at once, and stretching the shared European emergency system to a point it has rarely been stretched before. Pause here for a moment. If this breakdown is helping you understand what the headlines are not explaining, drop a comment with the name of your country. I genuinely want to see how far this story is reaching. And if you are new here, subscribing takes 2 seconds and tells the algorithm that people actually want the full context instead of a 30-second clip of flames. Now let me show you why these fires are behaving nothing like the fires Europe dealt with 30 years ago. Because that is the real question, isn't it? Europe has always had summer fires. Spain, Portugal, Greece, southern Italy, southern France, these places burn every year to some degree. So why does this feel different? Why are the numbers different? Why are the officials talking differently? The answer is not simply that it is hotter. The answer is that all the ingredients required for a catastrophic fire now arrive at the same time, far more often than they used to. Start with the ground itself. Europe has been drying out for years. Drought cycles that used to last a few weeks and then break with rainfall now stretch across whole months. And here's the critical part that most people miss. Fire risk does not rise in a straight line as land dries out. It escalates in a curve that suddenly goes vertical. Slightly dry vegetation is harder to ignite than wet vegetation, but not dramatically so. Severely dry vegetation is a completely different substance. It behaves like tinder. Any small ignition finds a landscape that is already prepared to burn in every direction. There is no natural braking system left in the environment, so the fires currently moving through Spanish mountain slopes and French pine forests are not burning through normal countryside. They are burning through landscapes that have been quietly loading up for this moment since spring. Then there is wind, and wind is why containment fails even when a country throws everything it owns at a fire. Firefighters have 2 main tools. They cut fire breaks, strips of land cleared of fuel so the fire runs out of things to eat. And they use aircraft to drop water and retardant to slow the front down. Under normal conditions, this works. It has worked for decades. But when the wind turns, the fire break that was protecting the west side of a village is suddenly behind the flames. The fire jumps. New fronts open in places nobody planned for. Crews and aircraft have to be repositioned, and repositioning takes time. In that time, more land burns, and the fire grows a new head with fresh momentum. Spanish officials warning about erratic winds were not describing some freak event. Erratic wind is a standard feature of southern European summer fire weather. That is exactly the point. The routine conditions are now enough to defeat a modern, well-funded firefighting force once a fire establishes itself in steep terrain. Now, let me go deeper on each country, because the detail underneath the headline numbers is what will help you understand what happens next. Spain's relationship with fire has shifted geographically, and that shift is the thing emergency planners are still catching up to. Spain has always fought fires in the south and along the Mediterranean coast. Those were the traditional high-risk zones. Resources were positioned accordingly. Public awareness was built around that map. But the fires burning west of Madrid are not in that traditional zone. They are in the central mountain landscape ringing the capital, in areas that people assumed were somewhat protected by elevation and distance from the hotter south. Cooler air, more moisture, different vegetation. And transport that civilian agencies cannot simply requisition on a Tuesday afternoon. Deploying it near Madrid was the government's way of saying, without saying it directly, that this had left the category of a normal summer fire season. And the 32,000 hectare fire northeast of the capital deserves far more attention than it received. 32,000 hectares is roughly the footprint of a large city, burning in a single event. It forced dozens of villages to evacuate, which means thousands of individual families packing what they could grab. Because of where it is burning. The great forest that stretches across that southwestern department is the largest forested area in Western Europe. And here is a fact most people do not know. It is largely artificial. It was planted in the 19th century to stabilize shifting sandy coastal dunes. It was an engineering project as much as a natural feature. It is dominated by maritime pine, and maritime pine is among the most flammable forest types. The trees are full of resins and oils. They shed needles that build up into a thick layer of dry fuel on the forest floor. With tourists and seasonal residents, so the evacuation involved tens of thousands of people who did not know the local roads, did not know the evacuation routes, may not have had a vehicle at all, and were in unfamiliar territory when the alert lit up their phone. Imagine that. You are on holiday. You are half asleep. Your phone screams an alert in a language you may not fully read, telling you to leave immediately. You have children, luggage, a rental car, and a single road out that thousands of other people are also trying to use. The emergency phone alert system did its job, but shelters in Bordeaux filling to capacity is the physical reality of what a peacetime mass evacuation actually looks like when it has to work in real time, in high summer, with the roads already busy. Let me come back to the wine question, because it goes further than most coverage admits. Bordeaux wine is not just a cultural product. It is a globally traded commodity of enormous value. Some of these appellations produce bottles that sell for hundreds, occasionally thousands of euros. And the thing that makes them possible cannot be relocated. You cannot move a vineyard. The value comes from a precise combination of soil composition, drainage, sunlight, temperature swing between day and night, and microclimate, refined over generations. Some vines are decades old, rooted in specific plots cultivated for one purpose. If fire or heavy smoke damage reached those vineyards, the loss would not be repaired with insurance money and a rebuild. It would be measured in decades of lost identity and reputation. The specialists who spoke publicly were trying to reassure people. They said the vineyards had not yet been directly affected and that the grapes were at a stage where smoke absorption was less likely. But notice the word doing all the heavy lifting in that sentence. Yet. The fires are still burning, the smoke is still in the air, the grapes are still on the vine. And every additional day of smoke over that region increases the uncertainty for an entire vintage that the world has already partly pre-sold. Italy adds a third dimension to all of this, and it is the one that worries scientists the most. Repetition without recovery. Sicily has had serious fire seasons in each of the last several summers. The scrubland and forest that burned a few years ago has not fully regrown, and when fire moves through land that is still in early recovery, it behaves differently and leaves worse damage behind. The soil is more exposed. The root networks that normally hold hillside earth in place are weaker or gone. So when the autumn and winter rains finally arrive, and they usually arrive hard, the water does not soak in, it runs off, taking soil with it. Landslides, blocked roads. Because we are about to get into what all of this actually means for the future. And this is the part most reports refuse to say clearly. Before that, if you have made it this far, you are clearly not a headline skimmer. So do something the headline skimmers won't. Tap like and send this to someone who still thinks a story like this ends when the flames go out. Because it doesn't. Let me show you why. There's a statistic that puts everything else in context, and it is the one I want you to remember long after this video ends. Spain helps Portugal. Germany, Sweden, and Croatia send teams to France. The system works because the bad years usually do not happen everywhere at once. That assumption is what is breaking. Right now, 8 nations are helping France, while crews from 3 countries assist Spain and Italy manages multiple regional crises at the same time. That is not the system operating comfortably. That is the system operating at its ceiling. So ask yourself the uncomfortable question. If burned area keeps expanding at anything close to the current rate, what happens in a year when Spain, France, Italy, Portugal, and Greece all hit crisis in the same fortnight? Who lends aircraft when everyone needs aircraft? Who sends crews when every crew is already deployed at home? That is the real story underneath the flames. Not just that Europe is burning, but that the safety net Europe built for burning is being tested at its edges, and the trend line is pointing the wrong way. There is another thing I want you to understand, and it matters for how you judge the people in these regions. The hundreds of thousands displaced did nothing wrong. They did not build recklessly in the wilderness. They did not ignore warnings. Most of them live in towns that have existed for centuries, sometimes longer, in landscapes their families have understood for generations. Their grandparents knew where the fires came from and when. Their parents knew which slopes to watch. That inherited knowledge was reliable for a very long time. It is not reliable anymore. Towns that have never burned in living memory are burning. Forests that were supposed to be too high, too cool, too damp to carry fire are carrying fire. The map that people held in their heads no longer matches the ground under their feet. That is a specific kind of loss that does not show up in damaged statistics. It is the loss of confidence in a place you thought you knew completely. And the recovery is far longer than the news cycle suggests. When the cameras leave, this is what remains. Families arguing with insurers over what a burnt house was actually worth. Farmers discovering that their olive trees, which their great-grandfather planted, did not survive, and cannot be replaced by anything that produces income within a decade. Small tourism businesses that lost their entire summer season, which for many of them is the season that pays for the whole year. There is the health dimension too, and it is badly underreported. Wildfire smoke is not simply unpleasant air. It carries fine particulate matter that goes deep into the lungs and passes into the bloodstream. For people with asthma, heart conditions, or respiratory illness, and for the elderly and very young, weeks of smoke exposure translate into real hospital admissions and real long-term harm, sometimes appearing months after the fire is out. And there is the psychological dimension, which almost nobody funds. Firefighters who work 20-hour shifts and still watched a village burn, parents who packed their children into a car at 2 a.m. with the sky glowing orange behind them, children who now flinch at the smell of a barbecue. These are the injuries that outlast the ash. So what actually happens next? Let me be honest with you rather than dramatic. The current fires will eventually come under control. They always do, either because crews finally get ahead of them or because the weather shifts, the humidity rises, and the fire loses its fuel and its wind. That moment will come, and there will be relief, and the news will move on. But the conditions underneath will not reset. Soil moisture deficits built over months do not disappear because of a few days of rain. Aquifers do not refill in a week. Forests that lost their canopy do not regrow in a season. Everything that made this year severe carries forward into the next one, unless there is a genuinely wet winter, and even then only partially. That is why officials across all 3 countries keep repeating the same careful sentence in different languages. We cannot fully control this until the weather changes. It is an admission of dependency. Modern states, with satellites, aircraft, thermal drones, and thousands of trained professionals, are ultimately waiting for the sky to cooperate. So what can actually be done? Because I do not want to leave you with only helplessness. Prevention works, and it is dramatically cheaper than response. Clearing fuel from around villages, managing forest density instead of letting dense stands build for decades, restoring the grazing and small-scale land use that used to keep undergrowth in check before rural populations moved to cities, building fire-resistant roofs and clearing vegetation from the immediate perimeter of homes. These measures are unglamorous. No politician cuts a ribbon for a fire break, but they save towns. Early warning matters enormously too. Satellite detection, thermal imaging drones, and automated alert systems can flag a fire while it is still small enough to fight. sturdy shoes, and something for your pets. No 2 routes out, not 1, because 1 may be blocked by fire or by traffic. Keep the fuel tank above half during fire season. These are small habits that quietly decide outcomes. And if you are watching from somewhere far away, wanting to help, give to verified emergency and recovery organizations working in the affected regions, the attention will fade within weeks. The need will last for years. So let me leave you with the picture as it stands. Hundreds of thousands of people sleeping tonight. In places that are not home. Firefighters from 8 countries working through darkness and air that hurts to breathe. Military aircraft dropping retardant over forests that were holiday postcards 2 weeks ago. A capital city under smoke. A wine region under threat. An island responding to 1,000 emergencies in a fortnight. A river in the north too low to serve the people who depend on it. An official standing in front of cameras choosing honesty over comfort, saying the words no one wants to hear. Not yet. We cannot stop it yet. Europe is not burning as a metaphor. It is burning as a fact. And the hardest truth in this whole story is that this was not the freak year. Judging by the trend, this was a preview. Forests that took a century to grow are gone in an afternoon. Towns with 1,000 years of history now have a before and an after. And the season is not finished. So stay with this story, not for the flames, but for what comes after them. Because the fire is the moment. What Europe decides to do next is the outcome. If this gave you the full picture, leave a like so it reaches someone else. Subscribe so you catch the follow-up when we track what happens to these regions after the cameras leave, and share it with one person who still believes this is somebody else's problem. It isn't. Not anymore.